So let's try to take this bill apart a little bit, if we might. So under this bill, you would have a spending cap, but the government could exceed the spending cap if emergency was declared and the legislature authorized by a 2/3 majority additional spending. Is that correct? Okay. And what's the definition of an emergency?
I think that would probably have to be a collective decision by the governor, perhaps even this legislature, given some financial crisis or extraordinary circumstance.
So no, I'm sorry. Mr. President, through you, the sponsor will continue to yield.
Continue to yield, Senator Robach.
I believe technically that the bill requires an emergency to be declared by the governor. So what's the definition of what the...
Line 8 of the bill, emergency shall mean an extraordinary, unforeseen, or unexpected occurrence, or combination of circumstances, including but not limited to natural disaster, invasion, terrorist attack, or economic calamity. I think it's pretty spelled out. Again, we're not trying to change existing law. We're trying to control spending. Given the fact is, again, when I was answering Senator Squadron's question, we had several years when inflation was at 2% and we were raising our spending at 8%, then having people later on say that was the reason why we had to raise taxes and fees on businesses, on everyday people. This is to try and control that in the future, as we did working along last year in the budget with the governor to control it last year, if that helps.
Mr. President, if the sponsor would continue to yield.
I will.
Thank you. And the cap would be set at the average of the 3 previous annual consumer price rate years over the previous year's aggregate SOF spending. How did you come along? Why did you decide on this formula for a base amount?
I think the logic with that was if there was a peak or a very depressed year, rather than take 1 year, as some other states have done, we wanted to take 3 years to try and give a fair average to get a very accurate picture, again, of the rate of inflation or growth, rather than base it on 1 year.
And have we, excuse me, Mr. President, if through you the sponsor would continue to yield.
Continue to yield, Senator Robach.
Absolutely, yeah. I will continue to yield for whatever questions Senator Krueger has.
Thank you so much. So quite a few other states have gone down the road of exploring spending caps or putting spending caps into effect or removing spending caps. And I'm just curious whether you have looked at the research from that and the findings from those states, particularly Colorado and California.
Say, I've not looked at the research from California or Colorado, but I've listened to the people of New York, who I believe 84% think New York spends too much, taxes too much, and does not live within its means. This is clearly what I believe a very logical, intelligent bill that will address those very, very concerns. And I have to say, I'm in that 84%, and not only as a legislator, but as a citizen, that feels we have to be the responsible parent and try and control how much we spend. I just think the evidence, again, is so compelling when you look at, our last 10 years of budgeting, given what was going on at the economy, and not having any parameter or ceiling on how much we spent, seemed to not put New York in a good shape, not for everyday citizens who are leaving because of taxes, not for businesses who are crying for less regulation and fees, not more. Clearly that policy without this has led to great growth, greater than the rate of inflation. So I'm not so concerned with Colorado or California, but I really am concerned with New York.
Thank you. I'm also very concerned with the state of New York, Senator Robach, which is why I'm asking about the research from other states. Mr. President, if through you the sponsor would continue to yield.
Sponsor continues to yield.
I will.
The research from other states actually shows that spending caps have a disproportionate impact on women, the elderly, the disabled, and the poor, how would we try to protect New York State from going down that road if we were to implement a spending cap as proposed by this bill?
I don't know how you could possibly quantify in a study it would treat everybody equally. A property tax or a cap on government spending, our operations, would only mean we couldn't grow greater than the rate of inflation. I would make the argument in reverse that it would help everyone regardless of gender, age, whatever, because they would not be, again, likely to have $14 billion of new taxes and fees on registering your car, licensing your car, going to a park. Those fees would not be necessary to be implemented on them as we've done before. I'd even go one step further. At a time Senator Squadron talked about the economy, anything we could do to make the ground more fertile for business would also give people of all genders, all parts of the state, a greater opportunity of getting employment, which I think would help them too. So I don't know, I've never seen any study, maybe you could tell me what it is, but I don't know how you could figure that putting a cap on our state spending operations would possibly impact somebody based on any of those demographics. I don't know how that could really be derived.
Thank you, Mr. President. If through you I might answer the sponsor's question and then continue with my questions, would that be okay?
Yes, on the bill, Senator Krueger.
Well, I wanted to answer the senator's question. The way you can find that out, Senator, is to review any number of reports that have come out that look at the impact of spending caps on other states. I have two reports specifically on Colorado and the impact of the Tabor legislation that was passed there. I have a terrific report that was put out by the Citizens Budget Commission in October 2010, reviewing the experience of other states that passed spending caps, including reviews of Colorado, Washington, Connecticut, New Jersey. I have several national studies looking at the impact of spending caps and proposed spending caps even by the federal government, a study by the National Women's Law Center highlighting the destructive impact specifically on women, children, the elderly, people of color, because when you put a spending cap and an arbitrary spending cap on budgets, you end up having to make specific cuts in state spending. And unfortunately, particularly in bad economic times, the disproportionate cuts to programs are in fact in education and health care and services to people with disabilities and senior citizens. And I'm sorry, Mr. President, if we could get a little more quiet, I'm having
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, may we please have some order and some quiet in here for the debate?
Thank you. So in fact, the research does show that spending caps lead to unequal distribution of the pain on people within states. So in follow-up, do you think that there might be a way to have a spending cap but also assure that we are not taking disproportionate hits on those our most vulnerable citizens?
I think that's pretty hypothetical and anecdotal. I don't know if there's any quantifiable information. You've said yes. Clearly, we know that taxes, registering your car, all those fees and taxes you imposed the last 2 years affect people of every income level, every part of the state. And, I've listened to you intently over 10 years. I know you're not afraid to raise taxes. You seem to even like them. I don't. I think there's a time and a place for everything. And clearly, even in the low-income part of my district, people said to me, Senator, really? They want to put a tax on sugar and salt? What next? Kool-Aid? And I said to them, yeah, some people really don't get it. They want to continue to raise and raise and raise. So I listen to people in my district. I don't want to hurt anybody disproportionately, but I think New York, we've got some great programs, ones I helped develop, but we're at a point now, I'll say it again, just like businesses, just like working families, just like people on a fixed income, not dramatically, just the rate of inflation, we need to tighten our belt. If we don't, and you vote against this, I guarantee you, you're right, Liz, we'll be back here to vote for some tax to cover the bill and the continued rate of growth greater than the rate of inflation. This to me is a no-brainer. You can try and cloud it with all these things, but either we're going to try to live a little bit more within our means and send a message to business and taxpayers, or we're not. We're going to continue to grow, grow, grow. And again, you know the great John F. Kennedy quote, the situation and crisis at hand should dictate the right government action. The time now, just a little, just logically, rein in spending a little bit at the rate of inflation. I don't think that will put anybody in too dramatic harm's way.
Mr. President, on the bill.
Senator Krueger on the bill.
Thank you. The evidence is not anecdotal. There has been an enormous amount of economic research from the states that have implemented spending caps. There has been an enormous amount of analysis of the impact on states that have created spending caps and even gone further and trapped themselves in a situation where they can't raise revenues or get themselves out of the situation if they require a two-thirds majority vote to do so. And in fact, Senator Robach's bill combines these two approaches, both of which there is substantive economic and quantitative data showing have caused enormous problems for other states. And interestingly, I find that Republican governors and Republican legislatures in other states who have gone down this road have needed to figure out how to reverse themselves. Now, the good news about this bill, as opposed to some bills that we saw earlier in the year that were variations on this theme, those bills would have been constitutional amendments. And if we were to change our Constitution requiring spending cap or a supermajority to resolve problems or raise revenues in emergency situations, then we truly would be in a situation where we might not be able to go back. So the good news is this is not an attempt to change the Constitution of New York State, but nonetheless, it's the same bad proposal for the state of New York. Senator Robach, in his description, argued that our taxes are too high. He says, I like taxes. I don't think I like taxes. I like to ensure fair taxation, and I believe that government needs to provide quality public services to the people of New York State, and unless I could somehow magically ensure that the state of New York could win the lottery to the tune of $129, $130 billion every year, I'm left with the reality that we need to collect our revenue in some way. So I do think fair, equitable, progressive taxation is the best option short of the lottery to provide money to make sure that we have roads and bridges, that we have police and fire, that we have a public school system throughout the state of New York that ensures that our young people have an opportunity to get a quality education and to compete in the world and the economy that they are in fact inheriting from us and need to do better with. So yes, I believe in fair taxation. I believe in justifiable state budgets, and I don't disagree with Senator Robach that there are reasonable questions to be raised about how we've made the decisions to raise money and spend money. For the record, I have been here about 9 years now, and I watched this budget grow and our taxes grow years before I was in the majority, years when I was in the majority, and now again when I'm in the minority. So I actually don't think it's a particularly healthy partisan blame game who raised taxes when, because both sides of the aisle did it. And records would show more of it happened under Republican control than Democratic control. But that's not really the point. The point is, how are we going to have a 21st century economy and a modern, justifiable budget? I would argue that this proposal, combining a spending cap with a requirement for a supermajority vote to get us out of something that we may have passed ourselves into, is absolutely the wrong way to go. And again, I could read, I probably have several hundred pages of reports and quantitative analysis of what went wrong in the states that went down the road, but I'll just highlight for a moment Colorado. Colorado, having put itself into a Tabor situation, found that the only way it could run government at the state and local level was to create a massive number of new public authorities, new municipal and local governments, new district governments, each of which had their own fees and taxes. So they had to get around the laws they had passed by creating literally a monster of government infrastructure. There is no evidence from the research that they've saved the taxpayers of Colorado any money. They have created a much more expensive infrastructure of government at the state, local, municipal, county level. They have trapped themselves into a situation they admit they don't really know how to get out of. They have, in the course of that situation, found themselves lowering their rate of quality of education in comparison to other states, reducing the services that they provide, becoming less competitive as a state government. And they are, I think, a poster child state for what we don't want to do. Connecticut has been in a less extreme situation. California in a more extreme situation recently, where their ability to solve their budgetary problems are infamous. A study done recently by the Citizens Budget Commission here in New York State lays out the questions New York State needs to address if it would imagine going forward with this model. First, what growth benchmark should determine the cap? No other state uses an inflation-only rate to calculate a cap. The 5 states that used inflation-based caps all adjusted for population growth to account for increases in demand for existing services. I don't think you're going to see me personally voting for a spending cap with a supermajority vote, but you've got to adjust for inflation when you factor any of this in. A growth factor set at the rate of inflation would likely require the state to reduce the services it provides. Costs for some services like education and health care historically grow at rates that exceed inflation and even inflation plus population. Limiting overall state spending growth to inflation would likely cause spending cuts in some areas as portions of the budget with faster growth rates consume a larger share of the resources and squeeze out other services. Again, why we need to think carefully about the impact on specific sectors of the state budget if we were to create a cap. An alternative and more prevalent benchmark is personal income growth, which is the basis for caps in 15 states. This typically provides for more generous limits. Based on past trends in New York, a cap based on personal income growth would allow growth of nearly twice the rate of inflation in a typical year. So again, I personally, Liz Krueger, am not in love with spending caps, but I would be much more open for a discussion of how we look at our budget in the context of personal income growth, not simply inflation, even adjusted over 1, 2, or 3 years. Second, again, reading from the Citizens Budget Commission report, New York would need to avoid the ratchet down effect experienced by Colorado. As I've already discussed, the impact on Colorado has been devastating, And they've been trying to figure out how to get out of the problems that were created when their first bill went into effect. And they also used a 3-year inflation average, by the way, with their original model. Third, you have to ask the questions about unintended consequences for local governments of a state spending cap. Because, in fact, with a state spending cap, what you do is shift the responsibility or the necessity for local government to raise more taxes at the local level as they see that their costs go up, but they can't turn to the state for reasonable growth in money. In fact, that's the sidebar discussion about property taxes in the state right now. If the state does pass into law a property tax cap, it literally means the one tax that localities now do not need to come to the state legislature for will have caps and controls on them. Some localities are coming and saying they want us to do that. I think it's an interesting tax policy dilemma, but there are localities that say, yes, stop us from increasing our taxes, cap us. Well, the problem is nobody's asking us to cap their spending. So if you're not capping local spending, but you're capping local taxes, something has to give somewhere. And that's what this would do at the state level. If you're capping state spending, but you still have real costs for the actual delivery of services, and we know the vast majority of those services happen at the local level, you are shifting a burden into either existing or new or soon to be created fees and tax structures at the local and county level. And I think you have to ask the hard questions about whether you're capping spending or transferring responsibility for taxing and spending to a different level of government. I also think we as elected officials are responsible, we should be responsible for making sound budgetary choices, tough budgetary choices, and leaving ourselves in a position where we decide to arbitrarily pick some numbers, throw them into a math formula, and say, that's where we're going to be, isn't really the responsible answer for legislators. We should be doing the hard work each year, although I actually think we should have a 2-year budget, so we should be doing the hard work in 2-year cycles to figure out what are the priorities for our economy, for our needs for our state, what are the circumstances that have occurred, and how are we going to get the money to spend on those priorities. I find it fascinating that even on a day where we're talking about approving a spending cap, there are also bills on this agenda that take money out of the state budget but don't explain how we're going to replace it, that create new programs that will cost the state money, but we don't explain how we're going to pay for them. I find it inconsistent for this body to be moving bills to spend new state money outside the context of the budget, to move revenues that have already been allocated for specific items in the general fund for other new purposes, and yet to be saying we need to have our own hands tied because apparently we can't be trusted to pass a budget and keep to it, so we need these spending cap rules. I don't believe this is the definition of responsible participatory democracy, and I really do urge my colleagues to spend a little time studying the research and the findings from other states around the country of how this was not a panacea, it was not a magic bullet, it just allowed new fees, new levels of government, new dilemmas for states, and it also translated into disproportionate cuts in programs that many of us would independently say should be the highest priorities for our state. I'll be voting no, Mr. President. Thank you.